We have a Q&A function. So if everybody wants to add their questions as we go in there, we'll then share them and Andrew will answer them either after each section or at the end of the webinar. I'm just going to give it 2 minutes just about CIBSE certification before we move on to Andrew. So obviously, thank you everybody for signing up and coming to the webinar. This is the first of many that we'll be hosting over the year. A little bit about CIBSE certification. Obviously, we're a subsidiary of CIBSE, and our main line of work is 2 areas. We obviously run personnel schemes for the energy industry for people who produce EPCs, decks, air conditioning reports, and things like that. And we also certify management systems. So we certify 9001, 14001, 45001, and 50001. So if you're interested in having your management system certified, our email address is at the bottom, but we can contact you as well. So I'll stop sharing my screen and we'll pass over to Andrew Piper. He'll be doing a presentation on restoring the Palace of Westminster. So I'll hand over to Andrew.
Thanks, Seb. And just to check, you can see my screen okay? Yep, okay. Perfect. So welcome everyone. As Seb said, my name's Andy Piper. I'm the Technical Director for the Restoration Renewal Delivery Authority, and I'll explain a little bit around, just checking you can all hear me okay, if someone can give me a thumbs up.
Yeah, great, we can hear you.
Yep, okay, perfect, thanks. So I'm the Technical Director for the Restoration Renewal Delivery Authority, and it really is honestly a pleasure to be able to present parts of this programme out to the wider construction field and engineering field. So my background is in engineering. I'm a chartered engineer through CIBSE, and I spent roughly around half my career in consultancy as a design engineer, working on multidisciplinary projects, often focused around police stations, red light services, blue light services, all those sorts of things. So, and about 10 years ago, I came to work in Parliament, and for the last 8 years, I've been working on the Restoration Renewal Programme. And like many people who come and work in Parliament, it is such a unique place to work, and hopefully you'll see some of that uniqueness as I go through the slide deck today. So oddly, this really doesn't need much of an introduction. The Palace of Westminster is recognised throughout the world. One just started. Take control back. It's recognised throughout the world, and it's an iconic building of Britain. Part of it dates back almost 1,000 years, with the original palace still partly intact today through Westminster Hall. It's obviously the seat of our democracy. It's a legislative building, but it's also a modern place of work for many thousands of pass holders to support what happens within the building. And fundamentally, the Restoration Renewal Programme was born out of a urgent need to undertake a major programme of works in the Palace of Westminster. So the last time, particularly the mechanical and electrical systems were replaced holistically as a whole, was post-war. So 1950s rebuild of the palace was the last time everything was replaced. And there's obviously lots of drainage systems that predate all of that. There's urgent need of repairs in terms of the building fabric. So, 4,000 windows, all needing some level of repair, and huge amount of stonework, which is also and already started, to be honest, a lot of repairs on the stonework of the Palace of Westminster. And what the Restoration Renewal Programme is there to do is to pick up from the estates team all the
Andrew, you've muted yourself.
Thank you. So the palace itself is really underpinned by its basement in terms of how it's serviced. So here you can just see one of the long stretches of services which run throughout the Palace of Westminster. Underneath this is an aging sewage system. So someone called Sir Isaac Shone installed a sewage ejector in 1888, so almost 130 years on, and that's still what is used to discharge almost all of the waste that comes out of the Palace of Westminster today. So, you know, the building has done really well to deliver and carry on delivering services. But it cannot carry on like this in perpetuity, and R&R will hopefully seek to restore it to something which will take it into another sort of 100+ years of use. And we're still in the process of trying to determine exactly what the scope of the programme will cover. But it's fair to say that no matter what the scale of the scope is, it's going to be a major programme in the billions of pounds. And with a sort of spend like that, it comes with a lot of scrutiny, but it also does come with a lot of benefits that can be both beneficial to the UK, whether that's jobs and skills. Particularly, we're trying to do a lot of work in terms of taking some of the work out of Westminster, putting it into the region. So we're already starting to do engagements up and down the country with various SMEs to work out how we can actually make that happen. There's lots that we can do in terms of apprentices. So you can see there's stone masons. Actually, there's a lot that we can do in terms of converting existing skills to work in heritage buildings, whether it's electricians and plumbers. So not just looking at those sort of specialist craft skills, but looking at converting generalists to know how to work in a heritage building, because there are so many heritage buildings across the UK. So a little history. So like Parliament and the Palace of Westminster, there's a lot of history that predates that. There's also a lot of history that predates this programme. I'll give you the sort of very short rundown of this, but fundamentally it all started back in 2007, which was the first real serious attempt to explain the problems that the palace faced in terms of its aging mechanical and electrical systems. And that put forward a proposition to deal with some of those, predominantly in the basement. But that wouldn't have dealt with everything. You know, all those services run throughout the 1,100 rooms. And there's lots of other problems with the palace, you know, whether it's accessibility, sustainability. We talked a little bit about stone conservation. So in 2012, a pre-feasibility study was undertaken, and that brought together all of the aspects of a major programme, from both fixing mechanical and electrical systems, dealing with issues with fire, asbestos strip out, and that put that all in one big report, which was then taken to Parliament, and Parliament said, okay, can completely understand the problem that faces us, and they asked for an independent options appraisal to say how that might be delivered, and that independent option appraisal was completed in 2014, and the smiley face represents where I turn up on the programme, so I can talk with pretty much authority from this point forward, because I was there to witness it all. So the independent options appraisal said, you know, you can do this broadly in 3 ways. You can stay in the palace and work around you. Half of you could leave whilst we take over half of the palace, and then we swap that over, or everyone can leave and we do it all in one and return everyone back at the same time. And because it's the Parliament, they set up a joint committee. So in 2016, a joint committee was set up to deliberate that report, as well as take evidence from institutions. So CIBSE was represented as part of that evidence taking, and there was a wider market engagement to understand what people thought about that. That put forward a recommendation to undertake the works under a full decant, where everyone left, and put forward proposals for what the scope of works may cover. And then that went through the houses, both houses voted to undertake the works, and in particular to set up 2 new bodies. So the sponsor body, which was there to be the client, alongside the delivery authority, who I work for, to be the delivery arm. Once those 2 bodies were established, a review was completed in 21 to check that, you know, with these new organisations, does everything look right? Is this definitely the right way to take things forward? And in 2022, it was decided by Parliament that actually the sponsor was too far disconnected from Parliament to allow good decisions to be made and ensure that what was being delivered in the end state was actually going to meet Parliament's requirements. So what's recently happened, and only in fact this year, the sponsor function has now been taken back in-house, which leaves us with really two arms to deliver the programme. So this is a very high level governance structure, but on the right hand side in the purple you see the delivery authority, where I'm based and many people in my team are, and we work with the client team within Parliament, who then are reporting through the corporate officers who are now accountable for this programme, reporting to the governance structure, which eventually leads back to the two houses. And as I say, I'm in the delivery authority, and we're very much the delivery arm of the programme to procure all the supply chain, all the contractors, undertake all the design work required to deliver the works, and we're accountable to that parliamentary in-house team. And what we're doing at the moment is really having another look at what it would mean to deliver this programme in a different way, with different ambitions and scope. So we're undertaking another options development to sort of revisit, recheck, understanding that the size of expenditure on this programme is huge. And before, Parliament commits to going down that path, making sure that all the right checks and balances, all the right governance, all the right assurance has been done on the plan, so effectively we can go forward with a shortlist option, which is then down selected for us to put through a business case for a strategic case, which will then be voted on to sort of really set with numbers this time in terms of the scale of the programme and the durations for it. So that's just a little bit of history. Hopefully this year will be a defining year where we really get the direction, understanding all the trade-offs that all the different ways of delivering this might mean. But whilst that's happening, and we support that process, there's a lot of good work that we've been using or been doing to use this time in terms of understanding the palace. And I'm just going to take you through some of that. So recognising that this palace itself originally was built over 30 plus years, it's been in occupation for many, many years after that. Obviously, with a building of this scale, you can't sit there and not do any work to this. So there's been lots of good work that's been done over the years. In the 70s, a lot of work was done to, really push the building in terms of a building which was originally, as we see later, to be around, procedural rooms and residencies, to move it to be the office and procedural space it is today, which then developed into a need for more office accommodation as members of the Commons became elected members and required space to do their constituency work. So there's a huge amount of records, and we're going through a process to try and put all those records in one place, and also add to those records for our own survey. So you can see on the screen there just some of the surveys that we have already started and are planning to undertake in the palace. And no doubt for you working on heritage buildings or other buildings, this will be of no surprise to you in terms of the sort of things that you need to go through to really understand the building that you're dealing with. And for us, we're going through a process of collecting survey information with an endpoint in mind. So whether we start the works in 3 years' time, 5 years' time, we need to know and understand everything about that building to allow us to procure the works. So we've set that end state in mind, and we're going through a process of sort of analysing all the information from archives in Kew to what is held by the existing estates team, making sure that we can validate the information where possible, undertaking a gap analysis on the information, and then going through a process which generally is desktop study, then intrusive survey on site to fill that body of information. And we've got a big programme of works which takes us over many years to get us the information required before we finally go to tender on this great building. Obviously, the days gone by of reports sitting in drawers, paper copies of everything, that really is not going to be helpful for us on a very long lead into a programme, and also information to be handed back to Parliament after many years. So as many buildings, we undertook a BIM survey. So we spent 2 years, starting in 2016, to do a point cloud scan and then build a Revit model of the entire Palace of Westminster, which is sort of phases 1, 2, and 3. And what we're doing now is starting to add information and geometry, or information behind the geometry information that we have. So this is just a sort of extract of the BIM model, so you can sort of see what it looks like. This is sort of a very pretty model at the moment. It's a very accurate model, as you can see by some of the level of detail, but it's not very data rich. So we are filling that model with as much data as we feel appropriate to lead into that start on site stage. And there was huge amounts of challenges even to deliver this model, you know, really thinking about, you know, buildings which aren't square. Revit wants to draw a straight line. The walls, the windows, everything's slightly different. So we had to generate a modelling guide to how this palace would be modelled, because the modelling guides that really are available now are around new builds, or, you know, your 80s building, which is predominantly built in a very different fashion to a 150-year-old building. So lots of good lessons learned from that. We've also started to use a model for renders. So we're using the Unreal Engine to generate pretty realistic, photorealistic renders of what the palace might be in the future. Again, this is really a stakeholder engagement tool, a tool required for consenting. But once you put all that effort into generating a highly detailed BIM model, then it becomes a lot easier to extract out some of the other use cases. And here you can see some of the images that we've been able to generate from that BIM model using the Unreal Engine. And as we start to go through our design process, obviously this will be hugely useful if we start to look at, you know, ambitions which go beyond just fixing the building and start to introduce new elements to the building. So this will be very helpful for that. But what we're really interested in at this stage is filling that model with data. So here you can see an extract of some of the safety data that we've been using. So safety data is highly useful for us today for you know, passing down to our supply chain as they undertake surveys on sites, for our own employees in the delivery authority to make sure they've got the information at hand, whether that's asbestos information, hazards around the building. And recognising that health and safety file eventually will be handing back at the end of the programme. Again, moving away from anything close to a paper copy, but embedding that all in a model and a database, which is added to. Hopefully many of these hazards will be removed as a result of undertaking the works on the programme, and we will only hand back the hazards which will remain, and no doubt there will still have to be some of those. As well as safety information, information about the assets of the building, whether it's the heritage collections, you know, whether it's the fabric, starting now to add details from the surveys, whether it's U values, G values, all that information, and then starting really to think about how now that information will be passed out securely through the supply chain as the programme starts to build. So really taking a data approach to information. And also here, this is a work in progress model of historic voids. So this is, I'll rerun it for you in a minute, but this is what's hidden behind the walls of the Palace of Westminster. So historically, the building was actually ventilated using really a stack-driven system with the two towers used to discharge air. I'll just rerun that one. And what linked all of those systems up was a whole series of smoke extracts and fresh air supply and discharge. And all of that, as I say, is hidden behind all of the walls. This is incredibly important for us to understand, not least for fire spread, but also does give us opportunities in terms of how we resurface that building going forward. So lots of work around understanding the building, and then starting to understand the client. And if you go back to the original brief that Charles Barry had, it was a very simple brief, only a few pages, really looked at what the Palace required to run a procedural elements of it, and also what was required in terms of space for accommodation. And as I say, when the Palace was first built, it was really built around residencies and procedural space. Now it's a palace which is all about office accommodation and procedural space and engaging with the public. So a very different brief has emerged from what Barry had. And when Barry got his brief, what was the sort of cultural context of that? Well, the Great Reform Act had just been passed, so this was about putting an electorate in place, which was predominantly, well, it wasn't predominantly, it was exclusively men who owned land, which put the electorate size at that point at around 500,000. So it was a building built not necessarily with public access in mind. And you compare that to the electorate size from 2019, we're now at 47 million voters. So a very different cultural context. And I think it's really important to understand, particularly with heritage buildings, what was the cultural context at the time that designs were perceived, and what was the technology that was available to them. And once you understand the building and those cultural contexts, it really does help you in terms of moving the building forward. So when we turned up and started to think about what the future requirements might be and how we might get them from Parliament, as with most organisations, you're sort of given an organisation chart. And in the Palace of Westminster, we were given what's called the earliest May, which is the procedural practice for how Parliament works. But that didn't really tell us really about all the functions within Parliament, how they interacted. So we spent a long time trying to sort of analyse how Parliament actually works. 19,000 people have access to that building. How do they interact? How does the Parliament come in? What does committee room bookings look like? And how do these all interface? So lots of information about building a body of knowledge around the client. And then the Palace is part of the parliamentary estate. So this is just part of the parliamentary estate, but predominantly on the northern end of the estate is office accommodation and some committee space for the House of Commons, and to the southern estates, office accommodation and some committee space for the House of Lords. So the two northern and southern estates obviously are highly linked to the Palace of Westminster, and both those estates started to grow out after the need for office accommodation was exceeded in the Palace of Westminster. And there were interventions in the 70s to build in courtyards to create more office space, but it wasn't enough to provide for all the elected members. And again, this is just a diagram of the sort of logistics that happens between all of those buildings. So we really had to understand how that palace operates, not just in terms of how members engage with it, but how it works from all the functions and the people that support the palace going forward. This is just a sort of diagram representation. You won't be able to read it, but effectively you have the House of Lords on the left and House of Commons on the right, the facilities that support both chambers and both houses in the middle, and really a plot of all the people that interact with the palace and how important it is for them to be close to the palace. This is really about understanding the sort of operating model within the palace of the two houses and those that service it. And from that, we generated two areas of requirements. So there's the sort of technical area requirements in terms of things that we might do to fix the building, which will have the the normal things around sustainability objectives, what we might be doing from security enhancements or technology brought in to allow room booking systems, all the way to the right hand side around business area requirements. So what does it mean to have a chamber? What is the brief for a chamber, two chambers? What's the need for the committee rooms for broadcasting? And we've captured those as best as we can in those business area requirements. And I'm just going to talk about the challenges of three of those. So this is the last section, then we'll be able to come to questions. So design challenges. Palace has got huge design challenges ahead of it, driven by the size, the scale, and the age of the palace. And again, thinking about that cultural context of when the palace was first designed. And with that cultural context in place, you know, inclusive design is not something I'm sure Charles Barry would have had at his forefront, thinking about good access for everyone, thinking about neurodiversity, and trying to apply good learning from best practice today to a building which is fundamentally already built. And of course, there's areas that can change, but there's many areas that won't be able to change much. So just one of the real challenges for us, and I think this sort of explains it, is the challenge of step-free access. So there are 28 existing lifts across the 6 floors, but there's only actually 6 that link all floors. There are 65 total floor levels once you start to include the towers. Buildings introduced in the 70s were introduced at different floor plates to the main floor plates that Charles Barry put in. So every time these interventions happen, the accessibility gets a lot harder. There's 96 different staircases. A lot of that was driven by the fact that this was a residency building. There was a real back of house, front of house to those staircases, and 12% of the building, if you ignore not being able to get in through doors, because actually there isn't a single compliant route into the palace, but there is only 12% of the area which is compliant with step-free access, and a single fully compliant lift. So the architects and engineers have spent a lot of time analysing how you might make that building more accessible, from all the local measures you might need to do to the introduction of new lifts. When Barry built the building, there was not one lift in the palace. Lifts were introduced post-Barry. So it was never designed to accept and accommodate lifts. And as lifts have increased in size to accommodate all people, that gets harder and harder to find suitable space. And we're now going through a process of heritage impact versus benefit versus cost and time to deliver, in terms of grading the percentage of step-free access that we will get throughout the palace. And obviously that's just looking at one protected characteristic, but we are looking at all areas of protected characteristic to see what interventions could be accommodated for those. So just one other area. So when Charles Barry built the palace, fire was at the forefront of his mind. So, you know, the courtyard spaces are there as well to bring natural daylight into all areas. It was also there to give some physical standoff in case of fire. The cast iron roofs, you know, there is no wood or organic material in the roofs. It is all cast iron and wrought iron up in the roof space. The floor plates themselves offer inherent resilience against fire. The masonry structure, there's jack arches. So there is very good fire compartments built into the original structure. But then if you cast your mind back to that historic void model that I just presented to you, when that system of ventilation and smoke was overlaid against the work of Barry, it really did compromise his original intent in terms of fire protection. And there's been a lot of good work over recent years to make the building resilient, or at least safe for fire and life safety. There's a lot more work that needs to be undertaken, predominantly around protecting the building, you know, extending water mist or sprinkler systems throughout the building. Compartment lines are really quite large still, so although people could get out of the building, there could still be a significant loss of areas of the building if a significant fire did take hold. And obviously it's those engineering services in the basement which are predominantly one of the main causes likely to generate a fire. Now, this building is a heritage building, and like all heritage buildings, it's not a case of building regulations. A building regulation approach on this building will simply not work. It cannot meet current building regulations for fire. As I say, it won't be able to meet current building regulations for accessibility. So we take an alert process as low as reasonably practical to reduce the fire risk down compared to the benefit or the impact, particularly against the heritage fabric, of reducing down that fire risk. And almost it's a case by case, room by room, 1,100 rooms, different fire safety objectives we're trying to achieve, but all underpinned by a fire safety case, so that we can go back with a proposal which does benefit or balance benefits against harm, and all of that introduced in a highly complex building, both complex in terms of the rabbit warren nature of the building, and complex in terms of how the building is used throughout the year, from state opening of thousands of people attending onto normal procedural use of the hundreds of members of both houses that attend. And then the last or the penultimate slide before we go to questions, and I've seen they've come in, so we'll go back to them. There's two main challenges, well, there's many challenges with the mechanical and electrical systems, but ventilating the building is a real tricky one. When Barry built the courtyards, obviously part of the courtyards was to bring fresh air in, but you can see here within these courtyards, over times, spaces have been built in the courtyards, which has both blocked the ability for fresh air to pass through the ranges, but also blocked natural daylight going into corridors. There's a lot of high density spaces. The uses have large swings between days, even between hours. The building itself needs to be protected. There's thoughts around what the heritage collections need, as well as the people. So all of this plays into what may be one of the biggest challenges facing us in terms of how far do you go with mechanically ventilating such a historic building. Ventilation voids do allow a lot of opportunity, but here on the right hand side you can see a bit of a heat map in terms of what the heritage impact would be to deliver ventilation to some of these spaces. And I'll just sort of bring you to this space here, which is a Royal Gallery, and hopefully you can all see that. So it's an absolutely beautiful space. It's a space which is used during the day for the House of Lords, as a flexible working space. It's also used on big occasions like state opening, where thousands of people will be in this space. I think background heating is probably the best of what I could describe is available in the Royal Gallery at the moment. Temperatures drop very low. The frescoes that you see on the wall are subject to condensation because of the swings in temperature. Vast amounts of single glazing. If you take this one this one room, which is obviously one of the biggest rooms in the Palace of Westminster, the challenge to provide a comfortable space in here for people, for the building, for the collections, and thinking about the different uses that it have, it is a pretty substantial project in its own right. And then you think about doing that in all of the 1,100 rooms, recognizing that the heritage value of some of those rooms does change a lot, but it's a very tricky challenge that we are faced with. And then the final one, before we come to questions, is space for primary plant and primary distribution. Plant rooms were added in the 1950s when the House of Commons was destroyed by incendiary bombs, and they took the advantage of that time to introduce far larger plant rooms and put some new major plant rooms in. But by today's standards, they're actually still quite small, and about half of the existing plant space in the Palace of Westminster is more like what you can see on the photograph here. So very small, very hard to access, a real rabbit warren in the basement. And the basement was only ever intended to be ventilation voids, with steam pipes in them. It was one of the first air-conditioned buildings in the world. using a complex system of dampers, shafts, steam heating throughout, but steam heating to drive a heated air system, hugely complex, was a real struggle to make work. But the legacy there is a basement that's mainly not fit for purpose. So we're looking at spaces where we can go down, but that introduces its own problems in terms of connectivity back into the building. And you can see an extract here of Old Palace Yard, which shows some of the historic or the archaeology which sits behind there of the old palace that stood on the same footprint of the current palace. So going down into the ground offers us probably as much challenge as going into the building itself, when you think about the sensitivity of the heritage and the archaeology that we will find in ground as we go down. And we're really thinking about long-term maintenance and replacement. And when you think about the steam heating system that's down in the basement at the moment, so although hard to integrate with renewable technologies, one of the advantages of the steam heating is that it's so highly dense in terms of the energy contained within steam that actually the pipe work's pretty reasonably small, and there's only really one main pipe with the condense on the return flow. We would be moving hopefully to a low temperature based system, which obviously creates huge uplift in terms of the size of pipes required to distribute at a low temperature throughout the building, as well as the need to sort of do thermal improvements to the building itself so that we can run the building at much lower temperature than is currently afforded through the radiators and fan cores, based on the steam system that we see in there. And obviously we're keen to introduce, where possible, energy efficiency measures, help Parliament achieve its carbon reduction targets, sitting right alongside the river. What can be done in terms of using the river as a heat source has been done at Battersea and many other areas, going down into the ground to use the ground as another heat source. But the palace is, a significant draw on energy, and it's going to be again a balance to make sure we go forward with the right level between major intervention versus harm either to the building itself from its heritage or harm to the archaeology that we might find below it. And that was it. Sebastian, I don't know if we wanted to go to questions.
Yeah, thanks. That was really informative. Yeah, if you want to submit any questions, at the top of the screen, there's a Q&A, and we'll review your questions and add them in, and we'll go through them now. I'll start from the earlier slides. So the first question was, will the slides be published?
We won't be publishing the slides, unfortunately, but it'll be available online in terms of the recording.
Yeah, so we're obviously recording it for ourselves, and we'll add this to our website and send out a link to it as well for you all to watch in your own time. So one of the first questions was it always a given that Parliament would remain there, in brackets, in POW, rather than build a new Parliament building elsewhere that would be more suitable for a modern democracy?
So it's come up a lot, this, as you can consider. I think when I showed the estate, there's one thing to be aware of. Parliament is separate to government to allow it to do its duty, and part of that duty is to hold government to account. But Parliament is obviously intrinsically linked to government, and if you move the parliamentary estate anywhere, in the UK, you've then got to think about how that relationship with government would continue to coexist, with members being members of their constituency, but also ministers as well. So it's not an easy thing just to move Parliament in isolation. And if you did move Parliament, there is still a major restoration programme required to the building itself. So although you wouldn't necessarily have to put in maybe all of the requirements for an operational Parliament, you've still got to do a substantial amount of restoration work. So it wouldn't mean that it's, you could leave this building and you put those two factors together, and then it actually probably starts to become more expensive than it would be to leave them in Westminster.
Perfect. Thanks, Andrew. Another question is the 3D laser scan and BIM modeling guide available to the public?
Yeah, so it's something that we're keen to make available actually somehow, particularly the how we undertook that. So it's definitely something in our to-do list. And as I say, this is taxpayers' money. We want to share as much information as possible. So definitely that is on our list to share that with others. Obviously, we're always learning, but we can definitely make version 1 available.
Perfect, great. So another question linked to Parliament, a more generic question as well, is to what extent will modern technology replace traditional skills, e.g. getting a 3D scanner and CNC machine to carve replacement stone rather than using a skilled stonemason?
So all good questions and all good things that we are looking at. I think AutoCAD do a very nice version of this, and there's stuff like finishing by hand, with the majority of the work done by computer aided machines. I think some of the areas where we're keen to leverage technology is really in the things which will have a big difference to our program and our schedule, and that's particularly the off-site manufacturing, on-site assembly. So the 3D, you could imagine a Meccano set of parts being produced, Wales or Scotland or anywhere in the UK, and coming to the Palace of Westminster to be assembled, whether that's assembled by robots or humans. But we're really keen to pursue modern methods of construction, and some of those more craft skills I'm sure will have an influence on, in terms of sort of the way that we're going to conduct a data-driven program, and employing these more niche supply chain will hopefully enable them to see some benefits and maybe think about working a bit differently. But they are progressive themselves, so it's happening with or without this program.
Right. Okay. Another question. Isn't there an expectation now post-COVID to mechanically ventilate spaces more than ever for high occupancy spaces?
Yeah, so it's a real challenge. So, going from the sort of 8 litres a second became 10 litres, 10 became 12, 12 is becoming 16, and it just keeps growing and growing and growing. But there is obviously a management way to deal with that as well. We've all learned how to work remotely, so it doesn't have to be infrastructure that grows. It could just be management procedures whereby you get the same, increase of air volume per person, but just by limiting the number of people that attend a building. But it is something that we're trying to work out with, and particularly for the sort of procedural spaces, to make sure that we can make them as resilient as possible to future pandemics.
Great. And can we assume that the target is actually net zero?
So, net zero is a challenge for all heritage buildings, and it will be a balance in terms of what we do within the palace and what is done by offsetting. Some of the enablers to net zero will be fundamentally what a move to electric heating might look like. So it's definitely a target for us that we're looking to achieve. It is complex. The palace doesn't have a huge opportunity for renewables, so it'll be heavily dependent on grid decarbonisation to achieve that target. But it is definitely a target, as is a major reduction in energy demand.
Great. Perfect. Thanks, Andrew. Another question is, has the possibility of keeping the steam heating by using district heating been explored?
So I think the infrastructure of the steam is the problem. So that is some of the older systems that we have in the palace, although it's hard to tell how old some of these systems are because of the piecemeal replacement that happens. But the boilers themselves are definitely well due for renewal. So I don't think we would want to keep the steam system there and move it to a district-based steam system, predominantly as other buildings are moving to electricity-based heating anyway on the estate. so it wouldn't feed into the wider estate plans.
Great, thanks for answering that. And again, linked to heating, is there any district heating schemes local that could reduce the plant space requirements?
Yeah, there are. So there's lots of opportunities. So there's the Southwestern Area Network, which is looking at joining up heat networks in the southern Westminster area, and we're well linked into those programs. Would it ever reduce the need for plant space? No, but definitely it could help with some of the problems that we're facing. So it's definitely something that we're pursuing.
Great. I'm going to do a couple more questions. So the next one is, how much of the Future Works programme will be taken up with the asbestos removal or plant room equipment removal?
Yeah, I mean, we're looking at in the order of 80% of the cost of this is driven by those core, where it's asbestos, mechanical and electrical replacements, fireworks, and what it means really to get access to the building in terms of fundamentally taking large parts of the interior away or down at least to get access to do what you need to do, and putting those back up in a conservation manner which would be acceptable to the consenting bodies of historic England and like. So a lot of the work is underpinned by just those priority area works.
Right, perfect, thanks. I'm just going to go, some people don't have the Q&A function for some reason, so I'm just going to go and quickly look in the chat. But one other question that was asked is, are there any current international R&R projects that you are engaging with?
Yeah, so we're part of the International Network of Parliamentary Properties, which is some 20 plus parliamentary estates across the world, and we have created this network through need, because trying to find peers in your own local area is problematic. And Canadians, the Austrians, we've got lots of good connections with people who have done this and people who are doing this. So the Austrians have just completed, and I think probably just about to open their major restoration renewal programme. The Canadian Parliaments are just undertaking their centre block, so they're a couple of years in. A very sort of similar looking structure, although built a lot earlier than or a lot later than Palace of Westminster. But we've got lots of good connections with our peers across the world, and taking a lot of good learning from what they're doing.
Great. I'll finish on this. Will there be further updates as the project progresses?
Definitely. I mean, one of our ambitions, and personally my ambition as an engineer, is to share what we're doing. So as I say, we're doing lots of good learning. We're working with other projects, trying to learn what they've done, take what they've done, apply that to our building, whether it's specific surveys. But we are keen to publish information to make it available to the wider community.
Great, and we'll probably do another follow-up webinar in the near future with Andrew. But I'm gonna stop Q&A there. Thank you very much, Andrew, for doing this webinar. It's been a great turnout. I hope everybody's enjoyed it. Just a quick one from me. We've got another webinar next month on Thursday, the 23rd of February. That will be on hydrogen and its future value, and that one will be on GoToWebinar. But for now, thank you very much, everyone. Have a good day.